This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
In your mother's death, it was like everything crashed and burned. And I said, you could have not said that more accurately. And so my whole worldview about setting goals, making a life for myself, having the stability to launch from, to have everything crumble in that moment of my mother's death, whether I like it or not, informs every similar instance in the future in my life.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. In this first episode of a two-part series, grief coach Shelby Forsythia is talking with me about being a student of grief and how she's created a meaningful life that honors the losses in her life. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice podcast is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
The sponsor for this week's episode is Barbara Carnes Books, featuring the work of award-winning hospice RN educator Barbara Carnes. BK Books is proud to offer the End-of-Life Guidelines series, a compilation of 5 essential education booklets designed to support those caring for terminally ill loved ones. Visit bkbooks.com today to order the End-of-Life Guidelines series to support your journey of compassionate caregiving. This episode is sponsored by Odonata Care, creators of the Hospice Care Plan. Hospice agencies and end-of-life doulas are now using the Hospice Care Plan booklet to support their patients and caregivers. It's become a trusted resource in the end-of-life community, helping to educate and equip caregivers. Visit thehospicecareplan.com today to purchase the Hospice Care Plan booklet.
I love today's guests. I know I've probably said that 500 times, but Shelby Forsythia is fantastic, and I love my conversation with her. Shelby is a grief coach, an author, and a podcast host. In 2020, she founded Life After Loss Academy. It's an online course and community that has helped dozens of grievers grow and find their way after death, divorce, diagnosis, and other major life transitions. Her work has been featured in the Huffington Post, Bustle, and the Oprah magazine. Following her mother's death in 2013, Shelby began calling herself a student of grief. And now she devotes her days to reading, writing, and speaking all about loss. Through a combination of mindfulness tools and intuitive, open-ended questions, she guides her clients to welcome grief as a teacher and to create meaningful lives that honor and include the heartbreaks that they themselves have faced. Shelby is going to be sharing her experience around the death of her mom when Shelby was only 21, and how she searched for grief support on the internet rather than looking for it locally in her community. We also discussed the generational differences that affect how people process their grief, whether you're a boomer or a Gen Z, Gen X, and where these different generations find support. Shelby also discussed with me how the supportive words we offer grievers may need to change and grow so that we can support the griever better. There are grief words, code phrases that can also help support grievers, and Shelby gives them an example of how that works as well. If you want to connect with Shelby, take her course, listen to her podcast, you can find her on her website, shelbyforsythia.com. If you're not sure about the spelling, just check the show notes. We'll have a link there for you. So here's my conversation with grief coach Shelby Forsythia. Shelby. I am so glad to have you on the Heart of Hospice. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here.
We've been chatting, and I feel like I already know you. We've talked about books. We've talked about all the people that work in the grief and death space that we admire. So this is going to be a really good conversation. We've already cussed a little bit even, or I did.
That's my favorite part.
Yeah. So we got all the good stuff out of the way, and there's more to come. So my listeners, so they can get to know you a little bit, I have an icebreaker question from the End of Life deck, which is the sibling deck of cards to the death deck, if you're familiar with the death deck.
Yes, Lisa Paul's work.
Yes. So the End of Life deck is a much smaller deck, but it's got some questions that can be used to have conversations with people who are experiencing hospice care and getting close to end of life. So I picked one out, not knowing you very well, so we'll see how I did. So this one's called Final Arrangement. Who would you like to be in charge of making your funeral arrangements?
Oh, this is an easy one. It's 1,000% my wife. Because she, first off, knows me better than anybody else in my life. And also, this is going to come out sideways, but I think a lot of people who are married might know what I mean. She's really good at following instructions. of the two of us in the relationship, if I write it down and put specifics and parentheticals and like little M- inclusions of this, and this, but not that, and this, and don't invite that, and this one, and make sure to specialize in this, everything followed perfectly to the letter. She is... somebody once referred to our relationship as me as the kite and her the kite string holder. And so she's very much an anchoring presence in my life. And I'm kind of up here doing all this stuff in the stratosphere. And she's like, I've got it. I've got you. And so rhythms and routines and written instructions, very much her jam. And so as long as I've written it, as long as I've done the work to write it down somewhere, she will do the work of executing it and it will be perfect.
It sounds like maybe she might even check them off as she went.
Yes.
Oh, I like her. I like her already.
She might even color code it.
Oh, snap. Maybe some highlighters, little boxes.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. She and I should meet. I like that.
Yes. Yeah. She would be the person who'd get it exactly right.
And doesn't everybody need somebody like that?
Yes. And I think it's so undervalued in our society. It's such a quiet way of showing care, but
yes.
It's the stuff of what I see in so many social media posts of like, my husband brought me my coffee, but it's just the way I like it.
Right.
And that extra step of like, not only did I do a nice thing for you, but I did it how you would like it done is such an act of care that I feel really grateful to have in her. And I know I would also have that from her in death.
So when you look at it flipped, the more important, maybe not more important, but the other important thing is that you would have written the instructions, which is where there's a gap, right, in the United States, because we don't like to have those conversations, even inner dialogue. We don't like to have those conversations. So those instructions aren't necessarily documented. And the folks who are the kite string holders can be flying blind.
Yes. Or they're like, there's the kite snapped and is off, somewhere else now. What do I do with the string? How do I honor this?
Exactly.
How do I honor the fact that the kite got stuck in a tree or crashed and burned? I don't know. I'm taking the metaphor a lot of places, but what do I do now that the kite's no longer flying? Yeah.
Exactly. And you're left trying to figure out, what do you do with this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, we've gotten off to a great start. Okay, so let's back up a little bit, and we're really going to dip in deeply. And remember, Shelby, you share what you're comfortable sharing. But I want to hear about your caregiving experience and the death of your mom.
Yeah, well, I call my mother's death the first and the worst because of all the grief experiences I've had in my life. And by now, there have been many. And as one of my friends joked just yesterday over coffee, she just experienced a horrific loss to the war in Gaza. She said, I am both too young for this and too old for this all at the same time. And that's how very much I feel about my grief experience. But my mother's death was the first and the worst. I had many smaller losses that sort of led up to her death. But in terms of the rug being pulled out from under me and then the floor and then the foundation of the house and then the center of the earth, that was her death. And my experience with caregiving honestly was very small. I remember receiving information from doctors and then a hospice nurse. I don't even know that there was a hospice team because everything happened so fast. It was all secondhand. And so I was hearing it either from my mother herself or from my father. And so what medical teams were relaying to them was then relayed to my sister and I. I was 21 at the time. My sister was 19. And we would have like family meetings, but mostly what that meant is we're going to tell you some really hard news that we heard from medical professionals. And so it was definitely filtered through whatever lens of protective parenthood that they chose to apply to it. I don't know that I ever received information straight from the hospice horse's mouth, for lack of better phrasing.
Right.
I definitely received it as, however, if at all, my parents chose to spin or filter the information for comfort or protection or simplicity.
So do you think that there may have also been a desire for privacy on the part of your parents?
Oh, sure. 1,000%. My father, before my mother's death, my father had 2 identical brain aneurysms, one on either side of his head, and which required 2 very different extensive surgeries. And I think there was a reckoning on his part. I'm going to assign emotions to him knowing full well that he can't speak for himself because he's not in this interview, the podcast, but I think there was almost this embarrassment at being mortal, because there were parts of the process of going in for surgery, going through surgery, recovering from surgery, where he wanted to hide the ways in which having your brain operated on makes you weak as a person. He couldn't drive for a while and he kept trying to drive and we would let him. There were words that he couldn't string together. He is a very mathematical engineering brain, and to solve problems and put puzzles together became difficult for him. And so I think there was this embarrassment is the word I'll choose because I don't want to go as deep as shame. I don't know that it was that. But at being mortal and to have to do all of that in front of your 2 children for whom in their entire life you've never been anything but strong and sturdy and stable and predictable.
Yes.
And so I think there was definitely seeing out, 10, 12 years from that now. I didn't understand it in the moment. I don't think I could have. I just saw my father becoming somebody I've never known him to be, and I didn't know how to put words to that. But now looking back, I can comprehend how he would want to soften the experience or almost put like a fuzzy screen over the experience of this is what is happening to me, because he didn't really want to be seen as all of that. I think only my mother really was the person who saw all of who he was as he was going through that process. And the same with my mother and her guard, that screen. It didn't really come all the way down until she was actively dying, which for me meant when they called in hospice, it was December 19th of 2013. She had had a recurrence of breast cancer. They had done surgeries to drain fluid off her lungs, but they're like, it's too late. We can't do any more than this. You should call in hospice. And hospice came and, brought a hospital bed into our home and gave my dad morphine to give her and all this stuff. So I never touched like the medical administration side of it. But what I heard, and I wish I could remember this from my parents or from the hospice nurse, I don't remember, was that we had in her condition 6 weeks to 6 months, and then she died in 7 days. And I saw the most real experience of what she was going through in the 7 days leading up to her dying. I don't know that she had the consciousness or the wherewithal or the energy to protect us from what was happening anymore. The day we called in hospice, she said, I hate that I'm doing this to you. I know what your life is going to look like, because her mom died when she was 22. And so she knew what it meant that my sister and I would be living all of life's milestones without her. And then from that point on, there was a very fast deterioration of communication and body control and energy, sleep regulation, just like anything. And so it became very quickly a very honest experience of what it was to die.
So the screen, the filter that she had kept between her and you and your sister was completely down because she could no longer maintain it.
I think that's a perfect way of saying that.
Yeah, which is what most parents do, right? These are my children, so they don't share in my thoughts and my burdens and my struggles the same way a sibling would. a close friend would.
Despite me being a fresh 21-year-old and my sister being 19, I think parents will always see their children as their babies, but even more so with my mother. We hadn't gotten to the place yet where we were friends as adults. We were still her children. And so to have that flavor of filter over the experience of her dying, I think she really tried to maintain that from a place of love, not a place of ignorance or hiding or deceit, but from a place of parental love for as long as she possibly could.
Right. Not a sense of control as if she could manage it, but a sense of managing it so it was healthy for you. Her version of what she thought would be healthiest for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If that makes
Exactly.
sense. I am loving this conversation, but we're going to take a break right now. There's more to come.
Want to learn more about caring for someone at end of life? Discover the End of Life Guideline series by Barbara Carnes. Here's Barbara Carnes to tell you more.
There is a normal, natural way of dying. My materials are written to guide and support anyone who is addressing end-of-life situations. The goal is to help people have a positive experience so families will have a sacred memory to carry with them.
The End of Life Guideline series prepares readers for the natural, normal process of dying and grief. It's a compilation of 5 of our most popular books, including A Time to Live, Living with a Life-Threatening Illness, The 11th Hour, A Caring Guideline for the Hours to Minutes Before Death, Pain and End of Life, What You Need to Know About End-of-Life Comfort and Pain Management, My Friend, I Care, The Grief Experience, and the most widely used hospice book, Gone From My Sight. To order the End of Life Guideline series, visit bkbooks.com. This series is available in digital format and volume discounts are also available. Just visit bkbooks.com. If you're a hospice caregiver looking for resources to enhance your care, look no further than the Hospice Care Plan, A Path to Comfort. Available in both English or Spanish, this invaluable resource is designed to support caregivers in providing the best possible care for their loved ones. The Hospice Care Plan from Odonata Care now has integrated QR codes in each section of the booklet. Readers simply scan the code with a smartphone, and a free playlist of videos provides practical tips for caregiving and symptom management. It's like having a personalized guide at your fingertips. Caregivers will find 150 videos offering expert advice and practical guidance to navigate every aspect of caregiving. Hospice agencies and end-of-life doulas are now using the Hospice Care Plan booklet to support their patients and caregivers. It's become a trusted resource in the end-of-life community, helping to educate and equip caregivers. Visit thehospicecareplan.com today to purchase the Hospice Care Plan booklet. Empower yourself and the ones you care for with a Hospice Care Plan, A Path to Comfort. That's thehospicecareplan.com.
So there's a lot of labeling going on these days. Millennials, Gen X, Gen Z, boomers. I personally happen to dislike that very much. I think that's labeling to the point of stereotyping people.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of boomer tendencies, but I am not a boomer, only by age, 1 year. But I don't agree that every boomer is a certain way and can't understand certain things, and every millennial is lazy and entitled. I don't think it works that way. I do know that different ages and stages process grief differently. So as a young person of 21 and your sister at 19, how would you describe the way you yourselves, and I'll say as millennials, young people, how did you process that caregiving experience and the loss?
Yeah, I can appreciate your perspective in that. And I think that, like most things, personality tests, Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, labels and buckets like that can take you so far. And then the rest of it is like where humanity shows up. It's like, yeah, I fall into this bucket, but then there's more. But wait, there's more.
Right.
So
At the end of the day, we're all just people, just humans.
Right. Simultaneously, though, I very much identify as a millennial in that major innovations and major world events I experienced kind of all with the same age group. I remember getting on AOL online for the first time when I was 5, and I instant messengered my grandmother because she had just sent my sister and I pajamas. And to hear that,
oh my gosh, yes, that horrible whining sound. Yes.
And to say, thanks for the jammies, Grandma, we're going to bed. And to be on a keyboard typing to her in another state, and have that be one of my first childhood experiences that I can vividly remember, is very different from somebody who grew up like my parents did in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And simultaneously, I was 9, 10, 11 when September 11th happened.
Yes.
And it was my father's birthday also. His birthday is 9/11. And so it became like a very formative experience of my childhood, just like other world and political events happened at that time. So I think there are things that generations, by no choice of their own, oftentimes witness or are swept up in at certain age groups. So it was different to be a boomer during 9/11 than it was to be a millennial during 9/11.
Sure.
But that still informs my perspective on the world. I'll tell you, my biggest grief hospice experience being a millennial is that I leaned on the internet for coping with grief. And I remember interviewing Hope Edelman in 2017, the author of Motherless Daughters, when I started my podcast. And she was like, when my mom died, it was the 70s. There was no place to look for grief support except your local church, community center, funeral home, etc. And most of the time, especially for parent loss, it was people in their 50s, 60s, 70s that were losing parents. It wasn't 17-year-olds. So I felt like a fish out of water in my grief experience. And so much of what I looked for and reached for and accessed in the aftermath of my mother's death was online. So podcasts were some of the first things I turned to, which is why I'm so excited that Heart of Hospice exists and why I chose to be a podcaster myself in grief. And then books. But I only really started to lean on books once I could comprehend words again. And podcasts that I found online were the doorway to helping me with that. It's hearing spoken words help my brain start to piece things together again and feel like I wasn't alone, which is a double whammy of wonder when you're grieving. But then also to start to lean on written words, but not just that, audiobooks, ebooks, like anything I could access that was easy and portable for my grief were very much what I leaned on. And I think there's a big generational difference there. People knowing now, Gen X and even Gen Alpha, I can find grief support online. It's as easy as looking it up on my phone.
Well,
like
that, social media.
It changes. And social media even.
Yeah, social media grief support is actually a huge thing.
Totally. And changes the whole grief experience. So I think that was probably the biggest kind of cornerstone of where I looked for support in my grief and how it really influenced where and who it came from. It was not local. My grief support was not in my community. My grief support was not in my hometown. My grief support was not a circle of folding chairs and a box of tissues in a church basement. It was very much.
Oh, I may have been to one of those. Oh, wow.
It was very much traveling to see people, going on a bereavement cruise, driving 3 hours out of town to meet with people who I'd met online, to talk about grief, attending, if you've heard of the Dinner Party, the organization that gets people together for dinner in their 20s and 30s who've experienced loss, and it's like potluck style, going to a stranger's home in Chicago, brought together by the magic of the internet. That was how I coped with her death.
So that's really interesting when you think about how, okay, so my generation, right? I'm almost 60. Grief groups for me would have been the ring of folding chairs in the church basement with donuts, and a box of Kleenex, right?
And then they turn it over in an hour, and now it's an AA meeting. Like
exactly.
A multi-purpose space.
And then when you leave, you're expected to help set up because there's a coverage supper after church on Sunday, right? So you had to,
or Bible study or whatever the case may be. Yeah.
But most of those people were going to look like my generation, the age I am now. Younger people probably would not have plugged in because there would not have been a relatable experience, a person who was relatable in age and experience and youth who could sit comfortably and have that conversation with you. As a young person, if I could go back, if I had had a loss at 21, which was a very long time ago for me back in the 80s, the late 80s, I would probably not have had a grief support place. Plus, I don't think there was the dialogue around it. People died. Right. They were old people more than likely, and the people that were losing them were old. And I just don't think there was a dialogue. But we had not experienced 9/11. We had not had mass school shootings where we sort of, I think we have learned to speak the language of grief. And I think the pandemic, that was one of the big lessons of the pandemic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And I both love and hate that grief is coming to even more of a global stage this way with the internet, but then having to go through these things collectively like COVID.
Yes.
It's like now we're having language for grief. Now we're having Time magazine pieces about grief that really resonate with a lot of people. Now we're having New York Times coverage of what it is to lose and experience not just death loss, but ambiguous loss, invisible loss, disenfranchised loss. Like we are having so many more conversations about grief, seemingly in more public spaces because we all have access to them. If you have a phone with an internet connection, you have access now to defining grief, to having frameworks for grief, to having podcasts about grief, to having support groups for grief. Like it all exists now. And a lot of that, I will say, the downside to that is that it can feel very overwhelming to know where to begin. And that's a lot of what I help my grieving clients with, is because it's like I'm overwhelmed with support resources. Should I do a therapist? Should I see a medium? Should I listen to a podcast? Should I read a book? Should I go on that retreat for $5,000? What, where? Oh my God, there's so much of it now. Which one is the right one for me? And so a lot of what I do with grieving clients is helping them figure out where to start, because just like no two people grieve the same, it's like no two people need the same type of support in their grief. And so figuring out, like, yeah, everybody's going to tell you need to see someone, like Lori Gottlieb's book, you just need to talk to someone. Sometimes therapy is not everybody's first go-to in life after loss, or if at all. Some people are like, therapy wasn't helpful for me, but you know what was, is like going on a retreat and 5 states away and meeting all these other people, looking at them face to face and knowing I wasn't crazy or alone, and then staying in touch with them for 10 years. Like, therapy has many different forms, I think, that it takes.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because talking about what fits and where to find it and which one to choose, it can be overwhelming. One of the things that I read recently was about the number of young people, and even younger than 19 and 21, children, teens, tweens, that have lost a significant, I don't want to use the word caregiver, but someone in a significant relationship role during the pandemic. So these are very young grievers, and they're growing not up into it, they're growing with it from a very early age. And I find that very remarkable. So the fact that we are having a global conversation about grief, a national conversation about grief, I think that's so timely. So, and maybe overdue, but definitely the pandemic really, really showed us there's this wave of this, and we need to be ready for it.
And I think in the best of circumstances, what these conversations open up is room for empathy, because your life is different when your first quote unquote big loss happens when you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s. Oh, they died because they were old, or they died because they got cancer or something different, versus one of your formative brain shaping, worldview shaping memories at age 7 is losing a parent to COVID. Like, it radically alters how you see the world, how you see yourself, what you trust and know to be safe, what you trust and know to be not safe, how you take care of yourself, how you interact with other people, how you form connections. Like, it really changes how you see the world. I did a podcast interview 3 years ago where I was a guest on somebody else's show, and she looks at me on the Zoom camera and she says, "Your mom died in your launchpad years." And I said, "Say more on that, because I've not heard that phrase before." And she said, I was in college at the time. She said, "You were constructing your entire life to launch into adulthood. And in your mother's death, it was like everything crashed and burned." And I said, "You could have not said that more accurately." And so my whole worldview about setting goals, making a life for myself, having the stability to launch from, to have everything crumble in that moment of my mother's death, whether I like it or not, informs every similar instance in the future in my life, because that happened at age 21. And you can call that trauma if you want, absolutely. You can also just call that a consequence of circumstances. But to have something like that happen, what happens when that happens at 10? What happens when that happens at 3? Before you even have words for the experience, you just know something great and irreplaceable has been lost in your DNA. Like, what happens to the rest of your life when that is true? So in my heart, it like ratchets open to so much empathy for people who are losing at such an extraordinarily young age.
So when you think about anticipatory grief, right? So a child who loses at 7, loses a parent at 17, loses a parent at 10, the anticipatory grief that goes with every single milestone in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
You can start it with the sentence, he won't be there for
Yep.
graduation, college tours, marriage, first child, first job, all of those things. There's anticipatory grief that you walk with every day.
Mm-hmm. The list is much longer because you have so much longer to live.
Exactly. I had never thought about it from that point, but it's interesting. It creates a very prolonged lifetime of grieving. And I mean, I've seen it with friends that were getting married and the dad has died. And so there's always that big thing, you know, traditionally in this country, we have the father-daughter dance.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden you realize he won't be there for that. That kind of milestone is missed. There's a lot of this to talk about, I think. I want to keep moving. I think we could get bogged down in that and really have a good conversation. But so I want to talk about the grief support that you received when you were younger. Because, okay, can we just say sometimes we suck at grief support for our friends?
Yes.
This is real. So, but one thing that I have noticed now that with the pandemic, there's been a lot of conversation about grief, but we're beginning to shame people for what they say. And I am beginning to find that problematic to the point where I think I realized it in myself. I was hesitant to say things to people about their loss because there are some really, really stupid things that are being said, right? But there's a lot of conversation about how lousy we are at grief support. And I'm of a mindset, okay, maybe you're going to say something that may not be the best fit for me in my grief, but it beats the hell out of saying nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have gotten to where we shame people. You can't even say, I'm sorry for your loss. Well, that's not adequate. It's not okay to say that. It sounds like something they say in Law and Order SVU. Seriously, right?
Yeah.
And then you have all the things that people say that are very religious centric that may not be appropriate, true, or applicable to my belief system. So they're not going to provide me with any comfort. You know, she's gained her wings. At least she's in a better place. These things that are fairly thoughtless.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we are starting to have a dialogue where we are shaming what people are trying to do to provide comfort. What do you think about that? Do you see that as a dialogue that's happening?
I see, for sure, I see a lot of the shaming happening. I find it very similar to being a queer person and the shaming that happens around language when referring to LGBTQIA plus people. And I think part of it is a desire to educate, but we sometimes fail, even in the grief space, and I've been guilty of this too, of like offering the next step. So instead of just saying, don't say this, silence. Say, don't say this. It's really helpful to do or say this instead. So to offer the substitute behavior, the substitute language, or the additional language, that's really helpful. And I think people who genuinely are interested in learning and want to be supportive have the emotional bandwidth to look past maybe the feelings of shame or to process the feelings of shame of, wow, I've been saying I'm so sorry for your loss for 10 years and now it's time to shift. But they have so much more emotional bandwidth than the grieving person does to expand or shift their behavior. And so to say, okay, so I know that that's no longer a way that people prefer to be supported, but I'm getting these suggestions instead to say something like, I'm here over and over and over again. Monday text, I'm here. Tuesday email, I'm here. Next month, showing up their porch, I'm here to mow the lawn, whatever the case may be.
Right.
6 months later, it's your dad's death anniversary, I'm here. like just to keep the repetition of that going. So from a grieving perspective, from the small chunk of minority identity that I hold as a queer person, I think the onus is on the majority, the non-grievers, the people who aren't already doing emotionally hefty work, to sit with the shame, because it's true, it's real. We all have it, and God knows I've effed up language and phrases that I've said to people both in the grief space and in other spaces. And you also say, I have it within me. I have the capacity to shift and adjust and correct that behavior, that language. Because something that I think that this is a grief that nobody talks about is the grief of always evolving. It's like, well, that language worked in the 60s. That language was just fine
why
in the 80s.
can't we just keep saying it?
Why can't we just keep saying my condolences, signed Acme Co? Like, why is that no longer enough as a corporate bereavement on a flowers card?
Exactly.
And I think there is a grief, and I've never said this on a podcast before, there's a grief in having to constantly evolve your language, your intention, the empathy that people perceive you as portraying. That is an exhausting process. I want to say that loud and clear. And also, we have been doing this as humans forever and ever. I just think with the evolution of technology, going back to the internet, language and sentiment and emotional intelligence are evolving faster than they used to. And I think it can be hard to keep up. And so I think something from supporters that can be really helpful to say is, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I don't know what else to say. And so I've had people text me and be like, this may or may not be helpful, but what I'm feeling right now is that this is going to, help you be stronger in the future, help you learn how to mother yourself, or help you learn how to this, that, and the other. So they're looking at my loss from a growth or self-improvement perspective, which to me is like kind of icky. But even with this asterisk of, this may be the wrong thing to say, or this may be a weird thing to say, or this may feel awkward, and then insert whatever here, it opens up just the tiniest bit of space for me as the grieving person to respond or course correct or say, part of that resonates, but I'm not ready to make meaning from it yet. Or I can see where you're coming from, but I'm too close to it to feel that way yet. And so to turn it more into a conversation instead of like, I'm sorry for your loss, thank you, which both have very clear periods on the end of those sentences.
Right. That's as far as I can get you. But
exactly.
So don't you think that there is an admission of, I understand this may not be a great fit for you, but my intention is here to support you.
I think that's beautiful. I personally find that very helpful.
Yeah.
Even when the God stuff is involved, and God's real tricky for me.
For so many people.
So if somebody comes at me, comes at me and says, this may not be a good fit for you, but what I'm holding to be true is this, I perceive it less as if they're trying to force or assign meaning onto me, and more so as, oh, this is how they're making meaning, and I can opt in if I want.
Right.
It feels much more optional as opposed to obligatory.
Right. They're not giving you your meaning. They're allowing you to draw from it. And I think that's super important. Even if you only got as far as, I'm sorry you're going through this.
Yeah.
Yeah. The intention there is there. It communicates. It communicates. I just think we've gotten a little bit self-conscious as grief supporters. I'm much more self-conscious than I used to be. And I think some of that is the cultural and political climate across the United States. As a middle-aged white lady living in the South, I've become acutely aware of who I am and my identity and what it says to other people. So when I have someone who's grieving, I am much more intentional about what I say. And because the resources are out there, and I mean, let's face it, my social media and all the connections I have are all related to death and dying and hospice and terminal illness and grief and bereavement. I know where to get those things from. Mm-hmm. I could reach out, send 5 emails, and be talking to grief experts, but I think it's much easier to access if you're willing to be open-minded about the conversations and be willing to grow. I think being growth-minded is really important.
Yeah, and I think as a supporter too, something that's really valuable to ask yourself is, am I looking to check this off my list? yep, I supported you, now I'm going to move on with my life? Or am I looking
Right.
to genuinely support them through the experience of grief? And I don't think, this might be a controversial opinion, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. Sometimes you are so far out in somebody's circle or network that like what you need to do is show your face once or twice at a funeral and then through a text message or at a memorial and then send flowers, something like that, and say they know that I showed up at that time in their life for them, and then you have other things to do and so do they. But if you are a person who's close enough to them that you are committing to being in a consistent role in their life as a form of grief support, then I think some deeper examination of the language that you use is necessary. So to say something like, I'm so sorry for your loss, Marie was a wonderful person. Again, love Acme and Co. with the beautiful bouquet you sent to the funeral.
Right.
That may be all you need to do. And of course, further introspection is fantastic. We would love that for you. Please bring a grief practitioner like one of us into your workplace. We will educate you night and day about things to say from a corporate perspective to your employees who've lost loved ones. But if you are somebody in someone's inner circle, you're a next door neighbor, you're someone who talks to them on a weekly basis, you're FaceTiming together all the time, you are in relationship with them in some way, it is really worth expanding your, I'm going to make an old-fashioned reference of Rolodex of grief phrases.
Even I know what that is.
Right?
That's hilarious.
It is worth expanding your library of grief phrases and language in order to continue to be a supporter for this person whose loved one has died, because grief goes on forever. And so support goes on forever, but how that evolves and shifts and changes over time will change. And I think in the beginning, a lot of it's going to come from you. But what's a really lovely gift of grief is that over time, and as the person who's grieving kind of gets their feet underneath them again as they move into the world, is then the language can start to be collaborative. So I'll give you one of my favorite examples is from one of my friends, Angela Morris on Instagram, who wrote the book Love Notes to Grievers, very famous for grief poetry. But when she was talking to me about the death of her father, she referred to the couch in her living room where she spent many of her grieving hours as Couch Island. And so now, whenever I'm in a space of deep grief where I have no energy and all I want to do is sit on the sofa and watch the Golden Girls for 15 hours, I don't look at my wife and say, all I want to do is sit on the sofa and watch the Golden Girls for 15 hours. I say, I'm going to Couch Island. And so now my wife and I will say things like, are we having Couch Island day? Are we going to Couch Island? Like what are we doing with our grief to come up with, secret phrases, catchphrases, spoken language that's only between the two of us to describe the experience of grief that we're having. You slowly start to create your own dictionary of grief words and phrases that become, I hesitate to say fun because I don't know that it's necessarily fun for anybody, but you connect in another way that goes beyond the scripted and the superficial that I think so many of the Hallmark cards we're surrounded by really, really lean on.
Well, I think there's a little bit of humor injected there. And there's
Couch
nothing
Island.
wrong with that. I know. And so when you think of it on a symbolic level, it's a sacred place that's set aside, right? For most people, it's the couch in your living room. But for you and your wife, when you need it to be this certain space, that's what it is. It's a place you go with intention. And this is what it's for. It's a little isolating, right? Some solitude. Yeah, I like that. And the fact that it is a little funny, it's sort of an inside joke between the two of you. How neat is that?
Yeah. It's one of my favorite things that happens over time with grief, especially if you are gifted the opportunity to support somebody for a long time and to watch how their grief grows and evolves as you get your own dictionary with it too.
Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com, and don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.